In the past 10 years, I can think of few products that have changed the way we, overlanders, four-wheel drivers, caravanners and campers, do things as much as lithium battery technology. Because it has changed everything in such a significant way, of course, what follows is controversy, arguments, misinformation, disinformation. And in amongst all of that, facts. My job today is to talk about the evolution of lithium batteries and how they've changed our lives, but more importantly, to try and separate myth and fantasy from fact. Actually, I'm separating the fact from the myth and fantasy. Sometimes it's difficult to tell them apart. It's 2024. That means 40 years that I've been exploring the world's most remote places in four-wheel drives, in association with the Overland Workshop. In order to do this, I am visiting Amptron batteries near my home in Western Australia. Frick, who is an integral part of a local battery manufacturer called Amptron. They have supplied my vehicles for the last 5 or so years, and as a disclaimer, they donate batteries to me in return for publicity, okay? But the story is not about Amptron. The story is about the evolution of these batteries and what they can do for us, and the differences between the different types. It's important to note that the battery we are talking about today are lithium iron phosphate batteries, LiFePO4. These are the only batteries we are talking about today. So when we talk about lithium, this is what we are talking about. There are different chemicals, different types of lithium batteries, and it's important to understand the difference. These are the batteries that we use in 4x4s, caravans, and that have changed the world. So, tell me a little bit about the evolution of these batteries, because when they started, they were a bit of a mystery. People were saying, oh, you can't use them because they catch fire, which was partly true. But they've evolved into a very safe product. Can you share with us a little bit about the evolution of this technology?
Yes, Andrew. I think most users probably became familiar with lithium batteries through consumer electronics, such as a mobile phone, typically.
Yeah. Yes.
We just got a little battery in there. Now, the term lithium ion, ION, as distinct from lithium iron phosphate,
right,
is a generic collection of all types of lithium chemistries being used.
Right.
The differences came into that the small consumer electronics typically use different lithium chemicals that allows the battery to have a higher energy density, so you can pack a lot more energy into a smaller form factor. But it came with the detriment that those chemical compounds are not necessarily as stable as some other lithium variants. So we can get more energy, but they don't necessarily last as long, so the life cycle is shorter. Plus, they are more hazardous. So you might, some of your users might have remembered some issues with Samsung batteries, yes. On their phone self-combusting.
That's right.
Those sort of scenarios earlier on, and those were consequences of especially lithium manganese oxide and a few other variants of lithium batteries being less stable. Later on, as we started to look at bigger and larger battery components, lithium iron phosphate as a combination really provides much more stability and higher safety levels. So the battery is much less, or the battery chemistry is much less prone to self-combust. So you must heat it up to a lot higher temperatures before there's a risk of what's called thermal runaway, as opposed to the other batteries. And one of the big benefits, especially for long-term applications, is that the cycle life of lithium iron phosphate is a lot better than a lot of the other lithium ion chemistries, but it has one detriment, which is that the energy density is a bit lower So if you were to have a lithium iron phosphate cell in your mobile phone, it would probably have to be quite a bit larger, quite a bit thicker to have the same capacity. And that's the trade-off. But for these large capacity batteries, lithium iron phosphate has been the go-to lithium ion technology for several years now because of those benefits, safety and longevity.
For those of you who are unclear about why lithium batteries are so cool, let's compare a lead acid battery of exactly the same size with lithium. The usable energy stored by a similar or same sized lithium is literally double the usable energy at 1/3 the weight. There are some penalties, however. Lead acid can handle far lower temperatures and far higher temperatures. I'm talking about ambient temperatures, operational temperatures. It's one of the things that lithium's quite sensitive to. But that is about the only limitation, but not the only limitation. When this technology found itself in a casing that was comparable to a lead acid battery, what were the early challenges?
The challenges comes that, I'm going to just grab this here, is that the battery is in its most essential components made up by a series of cells, which is packed in a certain configuration. These cells need to be managed. So unlike a lead acid battery, which the lead acid cells, if I can use that term, is really just needing to be controlled externally by whatever charge and discharge you're putting into it, these cells potentially poses a hazard. So if the cell is mistreated by putting too much voltage into them or draining them too low, they can either be damaged or potentially the cell can actually become unstable if you charge them at a too high rate. A lead acid battery might be damaged if you overcharge it, and it might be gassing, but it's not likely to self-combust or pose an actual hazard to users. And that's one of the challenges. So electronics had to be developed alongside the cells in order to manage the system. So the first requirement was, let's get these battery management systems there for safety purposes. So it would have certain parameters that would block charging, for example, if the cell voltages were to be exceeded, or would cut off the discharging if you were to try to drain the batteries too low, and some other protections. For example, if the internal temperature rises beyond a certain safe level, it would also block the discharging or charging of the batteries. Those sorts of safety aspects were probably one of the first things that had to be developed and added to the batteries in the first generation.
Right. So looking at this cell, I can see that because it's quite compact, it would be very easy, am I right, to configure them like this, or configure them like this, or configure them. So in other words, you don't no longer have to conform to a standard battery size. You have...
It did definitely pose more options in terms of battery configuration. Now you do get different form factors. So this is what's called the prismatic cell. It's more like a brick sort of structure.
Right.
You also get what's called cylindrical cells. That's more like the typical consumer batteries that people would typically use in household things, the smaller cylindrical battery cells. You also get something that's called a pouch cell. It's like a soft wall cell, but they can all be lithium iron phosphate.
Right.
There are different pros and cons about the different cell technologies, but yeah, in essence, you can arrange these cells to either get a desired voltage or to get a desired capacity, and you can combine these also to get, for example, if you need a narrower kind of battery,
yes,
or you need a large, flatter, lower profile battery. There are different options in how the internal structure can be arranged.
Right. So the elephant in the room, I think you will all agree. Firstly, the question is, it is possible to fit one of these batteries, standard size for example, in an engine bay to run the car's starting system, headlights, etc. My question to you is, why would anybody want to do that? And the second question I'm going to fire now is, it doesn't work terribly well, does it? And why not? I suggested that this was the elephant in the room, of course, because of the controversy. Recent stories in the press, lots and lots of them, about the use of lithium batteries in the engine bay. Now, I have been, full disclosure, approached by several battery manufacturers asking them, please can we fit batteries into your vehicles? And I have declined every one of them at this moment, except for one, Amtron. And my yardstick, and this is just me, it's just my opinion, my yardstick was this. If you are a lithium battery manufacturer, wholesaler, retailer, or whatever, and you are suggesting that it's okay to fit this technology in the engine bay, then you are lying to your customers. Or, let's tone it back a bit, not lying, but you're not being truthful. And here is why.
Okay. So we need to, just like an AGM battery is not designed to start a car, we need to first make that distinction. A starter battery is really designed for high current with a shallow discharge level.
Yes.
So the first challenge that you would have is, can you actually create enough current to start, especially a larger four-wheel drive vehicle, for example. Now, there are ways that we can make that. The bigger difficulty, which you've touched on earlier on, is that the heat that gets generated in the internal engine bay, especially under certain conditions, can be really high. And high temperature dramatically accelerates the aging of the battery. In other words, it will start losing capacity much faster than under, let's call it, ordinary usage. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you potentially cannot use it, but if you're looking at the cost difference, it doesn't always make sense. Are you going to be paying a higher price for a lithium-based, even starter battery, which due to the heat might only last as long as a conventional starter battery, which you can buy for maybe half or a third of the price sometimes? So that is one of the big challenges in the industry, why it's not recommended usually to put it in the engine bay. However, it is much more convenient from a space and utilization point of view to have the battery in the engine bay. You can have your whole interior area of the vehicle free, and that's probably the trade-off, Andrew. So can it be done? Yes, sort of. Does it work very well? Initially, it would be okay, but you are going to have an accelerated aging of the battery, and that is probably the biggest detriment, that people say, well, if I'm going to be investing this much cost into a lithium-based battery, but now, because of the accelerated aging, it's only going to give me a shortened lifetime compared to ordinary use. The economics doesn't always make sense.
I'm taking from this, there is actually no advantage, because your car's still going to start. Okay, good. What's the advantage of spending 3 times the price of a start battery and getting no perceivable advantage apart from the idea that the battery will last a bit longer? It probably won't, because of the high temperatures.
I probably just need to make one clarification.
Yes, please.
From earlier on. When I say that you can design a lithium battery in a starter battery application, in other words, to be able to deliver the high current that your starter motor requires, that is technically feasible.
Yes.
Or you can also use it as just like an AGM battery for deep cycle purposes. So you've still got your starter battery, and then you install your secondary battery under the engine bay for installation convenience, space utilization, all those sort of things.
Yes.
But like I said, it's really the heat is the biggest issue that's going to kill the battery early, and it comes with a financial cost.
Right. So I still don't see any real advantage to putting lithium, apart from if you're going to save a bit of space and put a second battery in the engine bay. If not, many cars have the space in the engine bay for that, but the cost would be a limited longevity of the actual battery itself. And that's what lithium batteries are very good at. Continuous, repeated, deep cycle applications. They are brilliant at it, far better than any AGM by a long shot. So, again, I'm trying to find a single good reason to put a lithium battery as a starter battery. You see, the thing is that when you're talking about maximum current draw, this then is a typical battery management system. All lithium batteries have them, and they, as we said before, prevent runaway discharge runaway discharge means huge amounts of current leaving the battery. The battery's temperature increases as a result of that current to the point where potentially the battery could actually catch fire, because lithium batteries are amazingly good at delivering current and incredible at absorbing current. So if you give them too much, they'll take it and get too hot. And that's control. It's not controlling it so much as limiting it. That's its most important job. Am I correct there?
That's correct.
Right. So a typical starter motor will draw 200 to 300 amps of current for a very short period of time. A lead acid battery is designed to do that. It can produce lots and lots of current. And a starter battery, which is a shallow cycle battery, in other words, it can deliver lots and lots of current really, really fast to that starter motor. The starter motor cranks and the motor starts, and then it turns off. The alternator kicks in and replaces that energy back into that battery. Shallow, they're called start batteries. They're designed to start the car primarily and then run the operations while the alternator is spinning. That's not what these are designed for.
No.
They're just not designed for that. So trying to get this technology to work there, to me, is nonsensical. It's not designed for it. But there's also no advantage to it. So
the only advantage that I might just add
yes.
is if you had a supposed starter lithium battery,
yes.
you could potentially use it for both starting and deep cycle applications, because the cell technology would allow that. So I can see the potential use case where someone would like to say, well, I'm just going to replace my starter battery with one of these batteries. It's going to start my car and it's going to run my fridge, for example. And that there's an advantage in that, potentially not having to fit another battery in another location with all the wiring and complications of that.
Thank you for helping me with that, because that is an advantage. It's not a great application and use of the technology, but I can see that some people might want to do that. Of course, then you run the risk of running your start battery flat and not being able to start the vehicle. But I can see a use case for that. So can we just go back a little bit on how these batteries have evolved, and not just for you, but in the general industry itself. I'm talking about these kind of batteries, this size battery used in four-wheel drives, caravans, campers, etc.
Yes. So like I said, initially, the purpose of the electronics that were fit alongside the cells was primarily for managing the battery and the battery cells in a safe way. But in the ever-changing integrated world that we live in, user requirements started to change. So the first thing is users wanted to say, well, I want to know what's the state of charge of my battery. I want to know how much energy is flowing in or out of the battery. So the first thing that started to happen is typically these sort of shunt-based systems were developed, which connects to the outside of the battery, just to the battery terminals, and it acts basically as a funnel through which all energy flows in and out. It can monitor the voltage, and it does basically an estimation of your battery system. So really providing some sort of information to the user. That was typically what the first generation from the batteries themselves, as a simple, dumb block, if I can say that, started with. Then these external shunt-based systems were added to get that initial type of feedback to the user of what's my battery system doing and where am I at.
Because not very long ago, before this technology, we used a voltmeter.
That's right.
So this is one of the things with the lead acid batteries. As the more you use it, the voltage drops. And the more load you put onto that battery, the more the voltage drops. So just by looking at the voltage, you can get an idea of the capacity remaining. It's a guide, but it is a guide that you can work with. How's my battery doing? Is it still full? Is it 50%? Or is it starting to die, and are things about to start switching off because the voltage has dropped? Lithium batteries, that doesn't happen. The amazing thing, and this is why I mentioned earlier of how the efficiency when compared to lead acid technology, is a lead acid technology, a typical battery will say 100 amp per hour. It can accept 100 amps per hour of energy. It can store it. But can it give it back? No, it can't, because that voltage starts dropping. And at about 50%, 55% discharge, thereabouts, batteries differ, items will start turning off because the voltage has dropped to the point where it's no longer sufficient to run it. So while it can take on and store that energy, it can't deliver it efficiently. Lithium changed that completely. You can, and am I correct, you can discharge a high quality lithium battery to 99% before that voltage starts dropping. Am I right?
Not completely.
Please.
So you are correct in that the voltage profile, if I can use that term, is much more flat. So if you were to plot it on a chart, say the battery is full, the initial few amp hours will see an initial dip in the voltage, and then the voltage flattens out for probably at least 80% or more of the battery capacity. There's a slight drop in voltage, but so slight that it's really difficult to get any real idea where you are. And then right at the very end, it's like a knee, there's a sudden dip in the voltage just before the battery runs out of power. So it is mostly what you said, Andrew, and that is also why you can connect a voltmeter to a lithium battery. The difficult part is going to be when you're in that flat part of the discharge curve. It's really difficult at that fine level of difference in the voltages between, say, a battery that's 70% or 30% full for the user really to understand where you are. Whereas with a lead acid battery, that curve is more like a linear. It's not a complete straight line, but you can think of it that way. In other words, you can say, well, if it was over here and now it's over here, I can roughly estimate on such and such a percentage.
Right.
Yes. And that is why we need something better than just voltage to try and determine what is my state of charge.
This is my point. Battery management systems and battery feedback to the user.
That's right.
So that, to you, is that a very important part of the evolution of these batteries?
It is. And I think also as user requirements, now that I think people have gotten used to the fact that they can, in a smaller form factor, store more energy, user requirements have changed. People are expecting now to do more from their system. They're running more appliances. They are using more energy because it allows you to do that. But now the question really starts to come, all right, well, how much have I used? How much have I got left? If you're off-grid camping, am I going to last for the rest of my trip? That sort of thing. So you just wanted to start to see what is the status of my system at the moment. That was really the very first driver.
The early days of, I put solar chargers in my vehicle close to 10 years ago, my first solar charger, and I remember, and I had orbital, there were orbital deep cycle batteries, and there was a lot of guesswork. I would kind of look at it and say, how's my voltage doing? And, I've got 7 amps coming in from my solar panel. Cool. And I would be very, very excited about it. And I would realize that I'm actually parked up. I'm not using any energy at all. And then the night would come, the fridge would continue running, and I could see voltage coming down a little bit. It's 12, and it was 12.4 last night. Obviously, the solar panel is not working. And then during the day, I'm excited now. Voltage current coming in from the solar panel, and I look at my thing and I'm like, it's back up to 12.4 volts. And I would get really excited about it. But everything was guesswork. Right, solar panels. I've played with them for about 2 decades now, and I absolutely love them. But I've noticed that there's a lot of information out there which is very misleading. And the new technology has allowed us to actually, we could have done it scientifically before with shunts, yes. I could have, yes. But the point is that the technology was available, but not commonly used in the four-wheel drive caravan and camping, which it is now. Yes. So let's talk a little bit about those monitoring systems and the different ones and the pros and cons of different battery monitoring systems.
Like I said, your most simple form is just a simple voltmeter. It will give you some sort of yardstick, but as you say, a lot of guesswork. In the lead acid world, you have some of those monitors which will translate the voltage to an estimated state of charge. So it gives you some sort of idea. But what you don't have is an idea of how much energy am I drawing from my system or putting in, for example, when you're charging with solar. So you don't really have a good feel for, am I using more than what I'm putting in?
Yes.
How much am I actually putting back into my system? And that makes it difficult to get any sort of practical data that I can manage and plan around it. So what we've then had is, the first part was the shunt-based system. I can explain, it's basically like a funnel. You can think of it as analogous to a flow meter on a fuel pump. When you're putting in fuel, it tells you, it counts how many liters you're doing in that space of time. It's basically the same idea. It counts how much energy is either flowing in or out of your battery bank. We're starting there. But what you don't have is, if, for example, we've got two batteries connected in parallel, and here is the kicker. If there's a problem with one of those two batteries, due to the nature of the parallel connections, you have no idea, because you see just the voltage being propped up by a good battery. So we are now starting to enter into a situation where, okay, well, what if I need a next level of information? How healthy is my battery? Do I have any way to warn me if there's maybe an issue? So we are then moving into, from just basic information to manage to monitor my energy usage, to the next level, which is saying, okay, well, now I want to be able to not just monitor, but also manage my system. Is there a problem? How healthy are things? If I have an issue, it helps me with troubleshooting to see, well, if there's a problem, where is the problem? What is going on? And that is where we need more than just a simplistic connection we can put on the outside of the battery terminals, which just measures the energy flow in and out, and maybe look at the voltage. Now we need something to tell me what of the internal electronics, what is actually happening, even at the individual cell level, temperature-wise, and health-wise, of all sorts of characteristics that is being managed. So that is sort of the next step up.
So that's the current evolution of these batteries. And I noticed that the recent ones I put into my recent truck have got these digital ports in the top of the battery. That was the only obvious difference between the old ones and the new ones, and an on-off switch.
That's right. So, I mean, the on-off switch is really there for convenience. So if you need to do any work on your system, it's really useful to be able to turn the battery off, de-energize your system, and now I can safely work with cables.
Even when it's connected?
Even when it's connected, yes. So it will completely block any discharging through the port. So, and that is handy. If, for example, you've got big, thick battery cables, if that, and I've done it, probably many people have done it accidentally.
Yes.
Something goes wrong, something slips out of your hand, something touches, and you've got
a big spark,
probably a lot of damage that can be caused. So it's a bit of an additional safety feature. So there are really now, in the next evolution of batteries, which let's call them smart batteries, we are now starting to get information and data directly from the electronics inside the battery, as opposed to something that's just sitting on the outside, trying to estimate and really do an educated guess of what is happening in my battery system.
Right.
Now that is typically done now through one of two things. Probably the first thing that we started to see were more some Bluetooth connectivity with an app-based approach. So in other words, I could use a wireless approach and I can get a fair bit of information from my battery. That's good, but I mean, there's only so much convenience in having to get out the app. If you want a physical display, it would not typically provide you an easy way to do that. You could mount maybe something like an iPad on the wall, but...
So, rewind just a little bit. I've got these two systems. I have the app, but I also have the Victron Turbo GX, which is giving me a good idea of my flow in, flow out energy levels. How long will it last at the current working environment, 2 days, whatever. But it's not giving me any information on the batteries on a cellular level, and I'm assuming that both my batteries, two in parallel, are healthy.
It does actually give you information. You might just not have discovered the feature.
Oh, okay.
I'll show you in a moment.
Okay, good.
But yes, so if I might just quickly rewind. So with Bluetooth connectivity, you can get an individual interacting with an individual battery. So that's a step up from a pure shunt-based monitor.
Right.
But in our integrated world, we no longer have just simple electronic components. These things are starting to become integrated into a cohesive system. And really what we are looking for in the latest evolution of these systems is a place where not just I've got my battery over there, I've got my inverter over there, I've got my charger over here, where these systems can actually at the system level communicate. In other words, share information between the systems and also present that to the user in a way that I can actually see what is my whole system doing. Okay, I've got so much coming in from my solar, or I'm discharging at this rate now, and my batteries, my solar systems, my chargers, and even some other equipment can all be displayed in a consolidated form. And even if you go the next step beyond that, it even allows those systems now to be remotely monitored. I no longer even have to be in front of it.
Yes.
I can jump onto my computer, as long as you've got an internet connected to the system, and I can actually track and monitor to see what's going on there.
Yes.
So it's really a stepwise evolution from really the most basic, dumb, just a cell-based system, then adding the basic electronics just to manage the systems, from the next level, which was doing some sort of external component to try and manage, or not manage, but rather monitor the system, then to having maybe a basic interaction through maybe an app on my phone, to complete integrated systems, and not just of a single battery, even an interconnected bank of batteries where that data is consolidated, so you can see information of the entire bank rather than just having to individually get data from individual battery components. So that's sort of where we are from the early start to where we are today.
Right. Very, very good. One of the things about lithium batteries is they last so long. You know, a typical start battery, if you get 5 years out of it, you're doing very, very well. These are far more than that. So tell me, Frick, what can I reasonably expect out of a lithium battery in terms of number of cycles? Okay, and is there a big difference between cheaply made batteries, more expensive batteries? Give me the bigger picture here.
So probably the single biggest factor that drives both the cost and the quality of the batteries is the type of cell being used. By type of cell, I'm not specifically talking about chemistry, that all lithium iron phosphate cells, but the manufacturing quality of these cells. And there are some big differences, both in terms of safety and in terms of cycle life. Now, as technology moves on, that is also improved. So when we look at probably the earlier versions of lithium iron phosphate battery, good quality cells, you could probably expect around 2,000 cycles minimum. When I say 2,000 cycles, a cycle is counted as from the battery being full right through to the low voltage cut off, if you were to count that as one cycle. In other words, 2 half cycles would count as one cycle. Okay, so you could, in theory, charge and discharge those cells around 2,000 times, and at the end of that period, you should still have around 80% of your original capacity. So there is a bit of capacity fade over time, but it's between 100% to 80%. It's sort of the window of what is classed as the useful life of a lithium iron phosphate battery. The latest evolutions where we are today, we can get cycle life up to 6,000 cycles. So it's doubled and almost tripled in some instances. I would probably say for your entry-level batteries, you should expect at least 2,000 cycles. And for premium batteries, you ought to be getting between 4,000 to 6,000 cycles. The reason why there's a bit of variance there, Andrew, is it does depend on the maximum discharge rate that the battery is designed to operate at. And some cells allow for higher discharge rate, but at a slightly diminished capacity. But for example, a 100 amp hour battery that you can discharge at a 200 amp rate, in other words, twice the cell capacity in discharge current, those cells need to be specially designed for that kind of application. It will come at a slightly lower battery life. Other cells you can only run at 100% or 1C of that capacity, but you might get an extended cycle life as a result. So, but I'd say today I would be expecting at a minimum of 2,000 at the absolute bare minimum entry-level market. Probably 3,000 cycles would be par for the course, and then you're up to 6,000 cycle at your premium level.
So where does your range of batteries sit in terms of that, what you've just described? Where would you say you stand?
Depending on the model, the models where we've got a high discharge rate in ratio to the capacity of the cells, you can expect around 4,000 cycles. Up to some of our models, you can get up to 6,000 cycles, cycle life out of the cells that we use. So, and that is where you really need to do a little bit of your homework. I would say the other thing that you want to look at is, like I said, what do people mean by a cycle? Is a cycle 100% of the capacity, or is cycles counted as a half a cycle or 80% of a cycle? Because if you were to discharge the cell only down to 80% of its capacity and not use the bottom 20%, you can potentially get close to double the cycle life. It is not a linear thing. The bottom portion of your cell discharge actually does has a bigger wear and tear effect than the top, say, 80%. And even shallower, you'd get even more.
And in our environment, caravans and campers and things like that, it might be quite a deep cycle, but it's rarely below than 20%. I know for myself, when my batteries are sitting at 20%, I'm thinking, well, when am I leaving? When am I going to next start my engine? Should I pull out a solar panel if I haven't already? And I might start thinking about doing something about the fact that my batteries, they don't go much below 20% ever. They can, and everything functions perfectly down at 10%, but I probably wouldn't often find myself like that. And I don't know if I'm a typical user. I suppose in some ways I am.
I think if customers ask us for advice on sizing of their system, we normally say, well, you want to plan to use up to 80%, and the extra 20% is really in the rare instance where maybe a bit of exceptional circumstances you may need to dip into that lower portion, and that's really just to make sure that the capacity of your system is designed well for your typical use. You don't want to actually design it so that my ordinary case I'm going to be using close to 100% of the capacity. Besides maybe a bit of an impact on the cycle life, which may not be a big deal for most people, considering you've already got thousands of cycles.
Right.
It's still probably you're sailing really close to the wind. I think it's better to design your system looking at sort of the 80% capacity. And if your normal usage is that, then you should be fine.
Right. This video will be seen by people all over the world. But here in Australia, we live in a bit of a nanny state. It is true. And lots of rules and regulations, and some recent rules and regulations about batteries installed into areas where one lives or even sits and drives. Now, why do you think, firstly, that these new, I was going to call them limitations, but what should we call it? Not limitations?
Just standards, really.
Standards.
Requirements. Really.
Requirements. Yeah. Why do you think they were introduced in the first place?
Look, I do think the primary driver was around customer safety. The reality is, even though these systems can be used safely, if you either misuse or abuse the systems, or if they're installed improperly without some appropriate safety mechanisms, they can cause problems and they can even become hazardous. So I think the primary driver was around electrical safety.
Even batteries with battery management systems built into them?
That's right, yes.
Okay.
Because you can, for example, still draw a fairly high current out of the battery.
Yes. And
the battery management system will happily provide that as long as it's within its maximum limitation. If you draw 200 amps, even at 12 volts, and you have running that through a too small wire or through a bad connection, you can get an extreme amount of heat built up, which can potentially even...
But that's the same with any kind of battery.
That's right.
No matter what kind of battery it is.
That's right. The other aspect that was driving it, particularly regarding lithium batteries, was probably a response to the fact that you do have the potential, let's say that, of a thermal runaway event, which is typically not something that was applicable in the lead acid world. So even lithium iron phosphate batteries, if you were to mishandle the cells, or if something were to go wrong, as much as they are generally safe, you can always have potentially maybe a failed component or a cell that's got a problem. You potentially could then get something bad happening, and these standards are really meant to make sure that the system is designed to handle any fault conditions in a safe manner.
Okay. So can you explain them to me? And I know that they're a bit ambiguous and a little bit difficult, certainly for me, from what I've read. I didn't quite understand all of them. Can you give me your take on these restrictions? What are we now required to do when installing these batteries into whatever platform?
Okay, so I think we need to make just a distinction between which standard we're talking about, Andrew, because it's important.
Yes.
There are separate standards, for example, for batteries that's connected to rooftop solar for a house. Different environment, different industry, different standards.
Right.
The new standard that we're talking about is called the AS-NZS, the Australian New Zealand standard 3001.2, the 2022 version. Now, as of November last year, November 2023, this standard became mandatory for what is called a connectable electrical installation. Now, we need to understand what that is. A connectable electrical installation is typically any installation which first and foremost can be connected to a mains power supply, typically to charge your batteries. For example, a caravan turning up in a caravan park, or a four-wheel drive turning up in a caravan park, and you connect to the main supply, or you're charging your batteries at home, that sort of scenario. So that is a connectable electrical installation, and anything which has got a habitable space, in other words, some sort of internal living arrangement, whether it's seating or sleeping arrangement, somewhere where you've got an internal space in the vehicle where you can live and reside in.
Right.
Those are really the installations that we're talking about. And this standard deals with a number of things, but amongst other things, there's a particular section around lithium batteries now, which wasn't there before. And it mandates, the primary thing is, first of all, it mandates certain safety standards that the batteries must comply with, called IEC 62619, which is an international safety standard. So that safety standard is both, there's a section of the standard that refers to the battery cells, so there's a particular certification that a cell can go through, or the entire battery pack, which includes all the electronics and everything in the build of the entire battery. So you need to comply with those standards now before you, or without which you're not actually allowed to use those lithium batteries in an installation. The next thing then are to do with, there are certain installation restrictions, in terms of it must not be accessible from the habitable areas. So let's take a little scenario. You've got your battery installed under a seat, whether it's in a caravan or four-wheel drive. The new standard now restricts us from letting the user being able to access that battery component from the internal living space, and it must be sealed. In other words, if there were to be any gases exposed to, they must be gassed outside. It must be in a sealed container, so those gases must have no way basically to enter the habitable area.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
These batteries on normal operations don't vent, do they?
No, they do not. On normal operating, there's no venting.
Yes.
Unlike lead-acid batteries, which can potentially still give off some hydrogen gas,
Yes.
there's no venting. It's
Yes.
really only in a scenario where there is something going wrong, some sort of failure.
Right.
And your safety mechanisms, and that this is some things which the standard applies to, deals first with how does the cell deal with those hazardous situations. And it's not just, I'll just say this, it's not just for when something happened during the normal course. You also have to think about what if the vehicle goes in a car accident and something gets smashed, something penetrates the wall of the battery, which can happen in an accident. Does the product fail safely? It doesn't expect the product to continue working, but it shouldn't necessarily just catch fire for no good reason.
Right. Does it fail safely?
Does it fail safely? And that's
Okay.
really
Okay.
what the safety standards are about.
Right.
As well as making sure that the battery is what it says it is. So
Okay.
it's sort of to keep it to account in terms of
Right.
what you're selling is really what you're selling.
Right. Okay.
So the cells have got some particular safety mechanisms in them. For example, there's a little vent here that would pop if there's too much pressure building up in the cell, or if something goes wrong. And then the electronics themselves must have a number of particular safety features that protects the battery. So that's first and foremost the safety standard and also the installation location. And then there's a third primary requirement that is also important, which wasn't there before. The user, the new standard actually requires the user to be given information of the battery system, basic information, doesn't have to be everything. The minimum requirements are really state of charge and maybe voltage. But the requirement now says that information must come from the internal management system. So in other words, a shunt-based system that purely connects to the external terminals on a battery, regardless of how much information that provides, is no longer compliant to the new requirements of the standard. The standard does allow for that information to be provided in a wireless way. For example, Bluetooth or a Wi-Fi connection to your battery.
Okay.
It does.
Okay.
But, and we've clarified this with some regulators, the expectation is then that whatever display or system you're using to provide that information must remain with the system. What I mean by that is, if for example it's simply a Bluetooth connection on your phone, what if you walk away, there's no longer any information remaining with the system. So that is not actually compliant. You must have something that is still visible there at the system level.
So can I ask about my system?
Yes.
Okay, it might be typical. I've got a Servo GX.
Yes.
It's giving me my monitoring. I've also got the app.
Yes.
Am I compliant?
Yes, you are.
Even though
But it's actually not the app that makes you compliant, it's actually the other system. The installed Servo GX with the display system there, that is the part that actually makes your system compliant.
Okay.
There are other ways. There are, for example, just standalone displays that you can also connect, that sort of thing. But that is something that you just need to be aware of, that an app on your phone where the phone does not remain with the system is actually not compliant.
Not compliant. Okay. And you, of course, have supply with your batteries a monitoring system.
That's right.
Okay.
We do have a few different options. There is a more simple physical display that can be connected to the system. But we also then allow for integration into other systems, typically something like the Victron Servo or any Victron GX device, where we can actually provide communication from the battery system to that system, which in turn will provide your data to the user through a display or whatever mechanism you've got.
Okay, all right. I hope that clarifies things. It certainly clarified things for me about this new ruling, because initially it was confusing, but thank you very much for that. I, for one, have learned quite a lot today. Thank you very, very much for your insight, and I hope that's helped you too. And if it has, do me a favor, just like the video. Tell YouTube that you like this kind of stuff. See you next time.